Okay, the exhibit that we have down here in Yarmouth at the History Center is abstract art. Art Quilts Maine started as a chapter in 1998. And myself, I didn't start until 2009. I started sewing when I was 7 years old. I always loved to sew. I learned from my grandmother and my mother. And then I went to school and I became a home economics teacher. That's what they were called back then, on to family and consumer science later on. And I actually taught sewing. But I started the quilting. My first quilt was a baby quilt for my cousin. And I really didn't know what I was doing, but I had a lot of fabric and I tried my best to put it together and it came out really pretty good. Through the years, I've done traditional quilting, and I now do traditional quilting, modern quilting, and art quilting. I like all of them. I like the challenge of being able to do my own thing, which is more art quilts, which I do like to use patterns sometimes, but more often I'd rather come up with my own design.
Quilters have always been a part of my family. I have a lot of antique quilts from my family. And my very first quilt was a little doll quilt about this big. I still have it. It looks terrible, but I remember sewing it and my mom saying, "Oh, that's just wonderful, Kathy. I think you should keep doing that." So it kind of blossomed from there. I didn't really get into quilting as much as I am now until probably the 70s. And I had kids of my own, and I made quilts for them and anybody who stood still long enough to get a quilt. So, and I'm also a member of Maine Machine Quilters, which is another chapter of Pine Tree Quilt Guild, but several other groups besides that, as well as Art Quilts Maine. So a lot of different avenues to express myself. Most contemporary and art quilts are meant to hang on the wall. They're not bed covers, where traditional quilts are more thought of as bed coverings. That doesn't mean that something that's as large as a bed quilt couldn't be an art quilt. It could. And like I said, there's a very gray line between what's traditional, contemporary, and art.
For traditional, for me, is there's a pattern, and it's more patchwork. Where if you went to modern quilts, it might be a patchwork, but there's more there's negative space involved with that. Whereas art quilts, you take an idea and you figure out what you want to do with that idea, what you're going to come up with. So it's more creative to me. We meet every other month. We start in October, go to December, February, April, and June. And then in August, we usually have some kind of a workshop. In October, what we do is we have a program for each meeting, usually. But then part of the October meeting is coming up with a list of words ahead of time or themes, and we choose a theme for our challenge quilt. It's called the Theme Challenge.
There's a whole bunch of suggestions, and then it's eliminated down to like several.
Out of those that didn't get eliminated, we pick your favorite two, and then it goes down to your favorite one. And one time we did have a tie, so we had to do that over again, and it broke the tie, so that was really good. And we have a reveal of what we've come up with that challenge at the June meeting. So you really pretty much work on your own. Sometimes during the meetings we have programs that might have something to do, like this exhibit is abstract, so we might have some things that would have to do with abstract. We do printing, we do photography, we do different color, mixed media.
So basically, though, we work on our own individually at home. That doesn't mean that we don't talk about things. If we had a question, we can ask other members, how would you do this? How would you go about interpreting this idea? But for the most part, we kind of keep it to ourselves, because then we can reveal it in June, and it's so much fun to see everybody's, rendition.
Usually in December, we pick a winter challenge that we actually do in a shorter period of time and reveal in April. One of them is displayed here. It's In Good Taste by Elaine Brown. What we had happen was one of the members would send us a word, and we had to take that word and come up with a design. Peppery, refreshing. Creamy, sweet, smoky, crunchy. Some of those that's what we had to go by, and we had to come up with something within a certain size. So most of us made them, our pieces, 9 by 9 or 10 by 10 or 11 by 11, and so that we could put, because there were 9 words in all, to make it into a quilt that was the size that we could display.
We did a thing on books one time.
Yeah.
Taking a traditional quilt block and interpreting it in your own fashion. We did the food challenge, taking words like bitter, sweet, that kind of thing, interpreting it into cloth, which was a challenge.
We did the Old Masters, which we would research different artists from the Renaissance, and
architecture.
Architecture was another one, and we have to come up with some kind of thing, and we have to be very concerned about copyright, especially lately, the last, I would say 8 or 10 years, we have to have permission if we use anything specific from somebody else's work. So that's, for myself, that's why I like to be more creative, so I don't have to worry about permission from somebody else. I know it's my work. It was my photograph that I took, this kind of thing. We've gone to different libraries. We've gone to Farmington, Madison, Lewiston to an art gallery. We've come here before in Yarmouth. We've gone to Portland Public Library. This year is the first time we're going to be going to Cape Elizabeth, to their library out there. And the members will come in and they get a chance to have the audience that's there, the people that are coming, to ask them about their individual quilts and how they came about making them and that kind of thing. It's kind of fun.
Everybody has a connection some way, somehow, to a quilter. You know, if you mention you're a quilter, oh yeah, my mother and my grandmother and my great-grandmother were quilters. And they are more than anxious to tell you about the quilts that they own. And I think quilts are very a tactile thing. It's not like a painting where you touch it and it's flat. A quilt is three-dimensional. And there's something about the touching of fabric. It's hard not to pet it, you know.
So when you at a distance, you can see some things, just like in a painting, you can see it, oh, wow, look at that. But up close with the quilt, you can see the different types of fabrics that are used, the way the stitching, how the piecing is, how things are put together, and maybe even different kinds of fabric. So like traditional quilts are typically made of cotton, whereas the art quilts have all different types of textiles that they put together and have it in. So, and like I'm looking at one right now that has little sparkles in it. Some of their quilting would be hand quilting, and you might find some of that in art quilts too. But there's the machine quilting, there's applique that you could put things on top of, or there's embellishing, like I mentioned sparkles a little while ago. One of my favorite things to do is abstract, and the way I like to do it is with draft paper, and I take the drafting paper, 3 sheets. I draw circles on one, or curves, and horizontal lines or vertical lines. And then I put them, each separate ones, on top of each other, and then wherever you see a T or an L, you don't want them you don't want to have any things so that they go through each other. So you erase some of it. The thing that I like the best about the abstract is I start with these lines. I have no idea what the finished product is gonna, or the finished design is gonna come out like, looking like. So anyway, so I did this, and my piece is called Shapes in Motion. And so what I tried to do was to, what colors do I want to use with this? So I kind of wanted to have it black and gray. And I found this fabric that my grandmother had in her stash that she has since passed away, but it's in my stash now, and I want to start using up my stash. So I said, I'm going to use my grandmother's fabric. And so that was the gray and the gold and the black that was I think that might even be a little bit of white in it. And with the black that I had, and then I had this beautiful fabric that I really liked. It looked like eyes, and it was white in the background. So I said, that'll probably go together, and it'll look pretty good. So I started putting it together, and what I did is I actually drew it on a little tiny piece of note paper, and then I had to enlarge it. And I enlarged it by doing grid work. I didn't take it to the could get it photocopied. However, sometimes I've done that before and have somebody else do it, but this time I just used grid work and made it larger. Another fabric that was in my grandmother's stash was a kind of a gold and black print, and so I wanted to use that too. I started with some of her black that she had in the stash, but the fabric was so old that it was starting to fall apart. So I had to get some of my own fabric and use the black that was hers. I noticed that I had a few empty spaces in my design, and two of the traditional blocks that I really like a lot is the pinwheel and the churn dash. So I tried to incorporate those in that. But as a modern quilter too, I tried to make it a little bit skewered, so it wasn't exactly perfect as a real traditional would be in some cases. My grandmother used to sew a lot of our clothes, and we really looked forward to Christmas where we get new pajamas. And so some of that fabric was in her stash. It doesn't happen to be in this particular piece, but I really liked using some of the fabric that my grandmother used. She didn't really do quilting, but my other grandmother did do a little bit of quilting. So using up the stash is kind of a fun thing to do, and to know that it's not just sitting on a shelf anymore.
And I think it's good to know that your grandmother's hands touched that fabric and then you're touching it.
Right.
You know, that real connection between the generations. We all have stashes, but it's really special when you have older relatives' stashes as well.
So the other thing about my grandmother is she worked at McClellan's back then, and she worked in the fabric department. And so of course she had all kinds of eyesight on all this good candy here. So she took all that fabric that she liked and purchased quite a bit of it. So I noticed that there's quite a relationship with that same thing. I go to a quilt shop and there's always something there that I like that, I think I can use that. I can buy a little bit of this and I can put it in this quilt.
I love bright colors. I love plaids and geometric fabrics and everything. So I just started cutting and sewing and cutting, and it kind of, to me, looked like sea urchins. And so I used black to kind of accentuate that feeling by the little pokey outy things they have. And then I thought, well, what goes with sea urchins? Well, seaweed goes with sea urchins, so I put all of my fibers that I've collected over the years in my stash along the edges. And then I thought, well, pearls are in, the ocean, so I used white buttons to give the idea of pearls. So that's where my piece came from. And it's been a while since I've seen it, so it was kind of fun to see it again. Because it's such a tactile art, that people want to feel it. And after you have thousands of people touching your quilt, it can get pretty grimy. So that's why we have the volunteers with the white gloves saying, sorry, please don't touch the quilt. But there are some quilts that are made specifically to be touched, Like, I remember somebody made a quilt because her granddaughter was blind, and so she wanted other people to feel this quilt, so it was all kinds of textures. She said, please touch it. So that was kind of cool, because this kid can't, or this child I should say, couldn't see the colors, but she could feel the texture. The artist that made this quilt is named Pat LaPierre, and several years ago there was a quilt at the quilt show that was basically an off-white quilt with lots and lots of pearls, embellished with pearl buttons. And I kind of was wondering, about her inspiration for doing this, and I read in the show booklet, I believe it was the Pledge of Allegiance in Braille. So you can imagine the amount of time and effort it took to sew all of these pearls on so that it could be read as Braille.
When we reveal the quilts in June, we collect them, and most everybody that made a challenge quilt will allow us to have it go on tour. There has been an exception before because they made it for a specific family member or special occasion. But the ones that are shown here are all of the challenge quilt that were abstract challenge. We have one quilt that's being displayed here that is a foodie word challenge. And we did have some more, but there just isn't enough room this time. So one of the quilts here is by Susie McCormick, and she taught a workshop for us how to make tessellations, how to take a square and make lines in it, and then you can cut it up and then it can be put together so all the pieces fit again. And she made her quilt, her abstract quilt is tessellations. What she did is she did that, then she manipulated a little bit more, and she liked what she had, and then she sent it off to be printed on fabric. And when she got it back, then she quilted it. And all of our quilts, by the way, are 3 layers. There's a top, batting in the middle, and then a backing on it. And we have a sleeve to hang them with. Sometimes they could be only 2 layers, but these that we have, because of the Maine quilts, that's what their requirements are. The other thing is they have certain requirements as to size that they can have their quilts. Another quilt, there's a lot of circles on it. It was made by Celeste Poulin, and what she did, we had another workshop one time at one of our programs where you used a product called 505. It's a spray adhesive, and you cut fabrics and then you lay the fabrics on it. Well, she used it to make the circles, and so it came out really, really great. A lot of people like that quilt.
The artist that was famous for it was Escher. He took all kinds of shapes and they all fit together. They tessellated. And it's kind of a hard thing to describe. You have to kind of see it.
And when you try to practice to do it, it doesn't always work out that way. You take that square or that triangle and you cut it and you make other lines, and then you cut it up and you try to put it back together, but in a different spot. It doesn't go right exactly back together where it was. And in fact, we had some quilts here last year that were the tessellation exhibit, and one of them, it looked like fish. It was really, really kind of neat. One quilt was made by Rana O'Connor, and she was out in California on a trip. And what she did is she purchased fabric on the trip, and she looked around. She has the yellow for the sunshine. She's got different colors for the water when she saw the ocean, Pacific Ocean, and the redwood trees. She's got different colors of the browns and reds for the redwood trees. And she tried to keep it simple to make it in squares that were strips. So because she was away and we had a deadline to get this quilt done, and I believe that had something to do with how she came up with that, but I'm not positive. Yeah. But it's really a beautiful quilt.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite quilt techniques. It's called a string quilt. And there's just so much you can do with it. You can make an art quilt from it. You can make, a baby quilt. It just depends on the fabrics and how you move the blocks around, especially if they're sewn diagonally like that. There's a lot with that strong diagonal. You can make a million different designs, kind of like a log cabin. A log cabin has a strong diagonal, and so you can make many different designs from a log cabin. But they're very fun and fast and lots of variety. I'm not sure exactly how Rana did it, if she just pieced the narrow strips together or she used a foundation. When I do string quilts, I use a foundation of some kind, usually paper, and you sew the strips down. The first one is right sides together, you flip it, you put another piece on, sew it, flip it. So it's very forgiving. It's often, if I'm going to go to a, what we call a sew-a-thon or a quiltathon, I'll take string blocks with me because there are no mistakes. And it's just, if I take something that requires a lot of thinking, I always mess it up. So I have to bring something simple. But they look a lot more involved than they really are.
Sometimes your foundation will be fabric.
Sometimes it's fabric. I use phone book paper because it's very lightweight and you can tear it away. But there are quilts that we have found with the paper still in it. Antique quilts, you'll find from 1900 or whatever. People usually start out with very traditional techniques, but then you can make it your own. I mean, like string quilts can be anywhere from super simple wool quilts to things like Rana's, where there are very specific color gradations. Every quilter that I know of takes a design and makes it her own, whether it's a choice of fabrics, placement, whatever. And sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing, because a block name may have 6 different names and it's the same block. So yeah, everybody does their own thing and makes it their own.
A log cabin block is one that starts with a piece of fabric in the middle, and then it has different fabric that goes around it, and it can be in different sizes. In fact, there's one here that was made, it's Charlene Huntley's quilt, and she's used fabric that was dyed, and some of it's hand dyed. She may have dyed some of it herself, or she may have purchased it as hand dyed fabrics. And she really tried to get to color is what was her big thing. But she used pretty much the traditional, it's kind of a log cabin.
Yeah, it's a log cabin variation by sewing the pieces in a circular fashion. There's applique. I mean,
there's different types of applique. There's machine applique, there's hand applique, needle turn applique, fusible applique. So it's all a matter of choice, what people want and what time they want to spend, or how much knowledge they have about doing it. Some people aren't good using their hands for needle turn applique.
Or how much time they have.
Or had time, or reverse applique.
Yeah.
Which
applique can be very representational, like flowers and leaves, and can be very involved, or it can be very simple, like an amoeba kind of shape, that you applique down. I'm not sure if there's any in this particular exhibit that's like that or not. But.
Well, possibly the thought of the circles before she came up with this particular technique that she used. It would usually be set on top of the fabric that's the base. And some would use a fusible product like a heat and bond or a misty fuse, or there's other products out there that they would use, and they'd adhere it to the back of the fabric and then just iron it on. That would be one. Machine applique, you could turn it and yourself, and then you might use a freezer paper, and you've turned it, glued it to the back, and so it's like a foundation, and then you sew around with your machine, and then you remove the paper later. Another type of applique would be needle turn applique, where it's all hand work and you do it by hand. And you try not to have your stitches show.
So in essence though, applique is putting one piece of fabric on top of another piece of fabric, instead of joining the fabrics with a seam right side together. And like Jane said, there's all different ways of techniques for applique, but based in the very base understanding of it, it's one fabric on top of another. Yeah, these are, these are appliqued. This is raw edge applique. And the simpler the shape on an applique, the easier it is to do. If you're getting really teeny tiny little like flower stems and you're trying to applique that down, that's a little harder than a larger shape.
And like a leaf in the fall, it's kind of crinkling up. So the raw edge would be a perfect thing for, Argenta Jeffries, she used this, and she wanted these leaves to be falling in the different colors because of the fall. And they do crinkle up a little bit. Yeah.
So, and these are appliqued down by the use of the quilting to depict the lines and the veins in the leaves themselves.
Which we sometimes refer to as thread painting.
Right.
And sometimes there's thread that's used as thread painting that actually makes a whole figure. Ukraine Rising by Allison Olds. She started out to do her abstract quilt with a
panel,
which is a pre-printed picture or something that you purchase. It's already a picture. And she was cutting it up to make her abstract quilt. And she was gonna probably put it together abstract. But then the things that's going on with Ukraine came about. And so she totally changed her whole design. This is what she came up with.
So this whole brings up the subject of quilts and mostly women's way of expressing their political views. If you go back forever, like the revolution and that, women were making quilts to express their political views because they didn't necessarily have a way of expressing it any other way because they didn't have the vote. Maybe not necessarily overt, like I hate so-and-so, but they would have a symbol denoting their political stance. Especially when it came to, I think, slavery. There was a lot of quilts made around that time. And this has been an ongoing thing for, years. So that's, I think, one of the things I really like about quilting the most. It can be anything to anybody. It can be a way of expressing your creativity, your political views, family, so on and so forth. If you like traditional, there's a million different traditional patterns you can use, or you can branch off and go in a different direction.
And just to add to that, a few years back when I was teaching, we took a group of students to Washington, D.C., and at that time they had the AIDS quilts, and they were all over the place. Yeah. You just saw thousands of quilts that were made, and they were by both men and women. They weren't made just by women. And even quilts today are made by both men and women, not just women make quilts.
I went to the Houston Quilt Show, which is one of the world's biggest quilt shows, and they had all of the AIDS quilts down the whole length of the convention center. It's a huge convention center where they have the political parties have their national conventions. And someone said, you need to take it a little bit at a time because it's very impactful. And I went, I'm okay. So I get out there and I'm looking, I'm like, I've got to take a break from viewing these because they were so emotional. Also, they had the same thing for 9/11. Mm-hmm. They had all the quilts there. So it's, like I said, it's a way of expressing your emotions and political standing. It's whatever you want to make of it. It can be an art piece that you hang on your wall. It can be a baby quilt that you make for your friend's first grandchild. It'd be a way of expressing your outrage at a certain political situation.
There's a quilt here called Cutting It Up, made by Pam Susie. And what she had done is she makes quilts or a quilted item for her family every year and tries to do something different. Her brother is an artist and he paints. And so this is a picture of something that he painted, and she had it blown up so that, so she sent it away to have it put on fabric. She added some pieces to her work that are 3D, and a lot of it's used with thread. And it just helps to embellish the quilt.
There's many different companies that if you send them a digital file of a picture, they will print it on fabric, and they have different kinds of fabric like sateen or broadcloth. There's different varieties of cloth, and they'll make it any size. And it's really nice because it's very color fast. Whereas if you can, there's also fabrics that you can put through your own printer, but because of the particular dyes in the printers, they're not very color fast. I had a quilt that I worked a long time on, and I had a picture of a boat, and then I had printed on my printer, and it got wet, and it all ran. So it didn't even look like a boat anymore. I knew it was a boat, but nobody else did. So it's really nice to have a place to send your design to and have them print it and be comfortable in knowing that it's going to last. I think a lot of times quilting for a lot of the Art Quilts members is a form of creative expression. You know, you may start out with a commercial pattern and then go in a different direction or different colors or whatever, but then it becomes your design, not somebody else's. So it's a way of expressing our creativity. Going to the website will give you a list of programs where the quilts are going to be displayed at. Just a lot of good information.
We'll definitely welcome new members anytime. The age doesn't matter. We would love to have younger people if they'd like to learn, beginners even if they like to learn, because this, you know, isn't something, not everybody has all the techniques down really good. You know, they might like to learn even I like to learn something new from other people.
Yeah, that's so. Besides, you know, getting together and sharing ideas, learning new techniques is always fun. And really doesn't matter your level of expertise, you know, come and join us, and, you know, we welcome all levels. It doesn't matter if you've been quilting or sewing for 6 months or 60 years.
The Yarmouth History Center is located at 118 East Elm Street in Yarmouth, Maine. We are open 10 to 4, Tuesday through Friday, and it is free of charge to all visitors.